He came home too late. A son who left the service early to care for his dying father, only to find him already gone. Betrayed at the will reading, stripped of wealth, and handed nothing but a collapsing orchard, a $50,000 debt, and an aging German shepherd no one wanted. He thought it was the end. But the dog, his father's last guardian, was about to uncover a secret worth $500 million. What happened next will break your heart, heal it again, and remind you of the power of loyalty. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe in second chances, if you believe no dog should ever be abandoned, hit that subscribe button, because this is a story you'll never forget. The sky over Willow Creek, Wyoming, was the color of steel that morning, the kind of heavy gray that pressed down on rooftops and seemed to slow even the flight of crows. A sharp November wind swept through the valley, rattling the faded banners that hung outside the courthouse, carrying with it the bitter scent of snow not far away. The town itself was quiet, built of old brick facades and wooden porches that had seen generations come and go. In the parking lot, Daniel Harper turned off the ignition of his aging Ford and sat in silence for a moment, his broad hands gripping the steering wheel as though it could anchor him to something solid. Daniel Dan Harper was 36, tall, with a rangy build hardened by years in the U.S. Coast Guard where he had worked as a mechanic, keeping ships alive in storms at sea. His dark hair, once thick and wavy, had begun to thin slightly at the temples, and his face, lean and angular, carried the etched lines of salt wind and sleepless nights. He was a man who rarely spoke unless necessary, whose pale gray eyes seemed to carry both resilience and exhaustion. The service had trained him to be precise, efficient, dependable, but it had not trained him to handle the silence of a phone call saying, "Your father is dying." He had requested early release from his contract, and though the request had been approved, by the time he reached Wyoming, his father was already gone. The regret sat inside him like an anchor. Inside the courthouse, the will reading was already in motion. At the long mahogany table sat Mary Beth Harper, the eldest sibling. Mary Beth was 41, elegant in a way that came from practiced performance rather than natural grace. She wore a cream-colored blouse and pearl earrings, her blonde hair pinned into a flawless twist at the nape of her neck. She had always been tall and slim, a high school prom queen who had married well, divorced strategically, and learned how to wield pity like a blade. Her gaze swept over her younger brother not with cruelty, but with a dismissive sympathy that somehow cut deeper, as if she had already written him off as irrelevant. Next to her sat Kyle Harper, 39, the middle sibling. Kyle had the stocky build of a man who once played football but had long since traded discipline for convenience. His thinning, sandy hair was combed carefully, his suit a size too tight across the stomach. Kyle was a man of jokes and easy charm, the type who shook hands warmly and left with your wallet. Behind his practiced smile was a nervous twitch in his jaw. He had debts, Dan knew, and debts made people pliable. At the head of the table sat Mr. Walter Gibbs, the family lawyer, a man in his late 60s with a narrow frame and a pinched face. He wore a gray suit that seemed to match the courthouse walls, his voice monotone as he read through the document. Gibbs was the kind of man who seemed to have been born already old, precise and colorless, but today his eyes flickered occasionally toward Mary Beth and Kyle in ways that made Dan uneasy. Dan sat opposite them, his faded plaid shirt and scuffed boots an unspoken contrast to their polish. He had not come for inheritance. He had come only to stand in the last shadow of his father. The man had been distant, a former military officer himself, strict and unyielding. Yet in the absence of words, there had been gestures, a hand on the shoulder, a nod of approval after a hard day's work. Those were the fragments Dan clung to, the reading wound through charitable bequests, small accounts, and then the division of the estate. Mary Beth received a trust fund for her children. Kyle received a slice of liquid assets and a property in Denver. Dan waited, knowing little was likely left for him. Gibbs cleared his throat, his voice steady but his fingers tightening on the paper. To Daniel Harper, he read, is bequeathed the Harper Orchard located on Route 12, including all structures and land therein. He paused, adjusted his glasses, as well as the responsibility for associated tax obligations. Dan blinked. The orchard, a once proud apple farm now reduced to skeletal barns and weeds, and with it, the unpaid tax burden of $50,000. Mary Beth offered a soft sigh, tilting her head. Dan, it's really for the best. You know how Father always wanted you to have something to care for. Kyle smirked faintly. And the dog, he added quickly. Scout. Someone has to take him. From the corner of the room came the scrape of claws on tile. A German shepherd, large and broad-shouldered despite his age, padded forward. His coat was black and tan, his muzzle silvered with years. A faint scar traced along his right flank, and his left ear dipped slightly at the tip, giving him a perpetually thoughtful look. His amber eyes, deep and unwavering, settled on Dan as if measuring him. Scout had been their father's dog, trained long ago as a search and rescue partner during volunteer missions in the mountains. The name Scout had been chosen by their father after the dog's first rescue. He had tracked a lost boy through a snowstorm, guiding the search party straight to the child who was unconscious but alive. Their father had told that story every autumn, his stern face softening only when he spoke the word Scout. The name was not just a call, it was a badge of honor. Mary Beth wrinkled her nose delicately. Honestly, it would be easier to leave him at the shelter. He's old. He won't last much longer. Dan reached down, his hand brushing against the thick fur at the back of Scout's neck. The dog leaned into the touch without hesitation. In that single motion, Dan felt more connection to his father than he had in the entire sterile will reading. It was as if the man's silence, his unspoken lessons, were all carried forward in this creature. I'll take him, Dan said simply. His voice was rough but final. The room was quiet for a moment. Kyle shrugged, Mary Beth pursed her lips, and Gibbs folded the papers neatly. The matter was settled, at least on the surface, but Dan felt the weight of something unspoken, something missing in the edges of the will, as though the truth had been bent by careful hands. When the proceedings ended, Dan clipped the leash onto Scout's collar. The dog stood tall despite his years, his chest broad, his head lifted, as though he knew he had just been passed from one commander to another. Outside, the November wind cut sharp across the courthouse steps. Scout's ears twitched. The wind carried the faint chime of bells from the church tower, the echo of his father's funeral. Dan tightened his grip on the leash. This was all he had left. A ruined orchard, a debt that could bury him, and a dog that no one wanted. Yet as they walked into the biting wind, Scout pressed close against his leg, steady and sure. For the first time since the phone call, Dan felt he wasn't entirely alone. The days after the will reading blurred into one another like cheap whiskey poured over cracked ice. November settled heavy on Willow Creek, the kind of cold that seeped into bones and never left. The Harper orchard, once acres of green and ripe fruit, was now only a shadow. The barn leaned at an angle like it had grown weary of standing. The house creaked each time the wind pushed, and the fields were littered with brittle grass and broken fence posts. Daniel Harper spent most evenings in the kitchen, the only room with a functioning heater, counting the days until the county would call for its $50,000 tax payment, a sum he knew he could never meet. Bottles lined the counter like soldiers fallen in a row. Dan was tall but stooped now, his plaid shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his eyes dulled by drink. He poured, swallowed, stared at the ceiling as if his father's shadow might appear there. Across the floor lay Scout, stretched long on the worn linoleum, head resting on paws, eyes open, and always watching. The German shepherd was 9 years old, a veteran in his own right. His ears pricked at every sound, his tail moved only when necessary, and his eyes seemed to hold a patience older than any human. He never strayed more than a few feet from Dan, as though tethered by loyalty. On the fourth night of rain, with the storm dragging branches across the roof like nails, Scout rose suddenly. He gave 2 short barks followed by a long one, the pattern he used during his canine days whenever he scented metal. Dan looked down, half drunk, and frowned. The dog was pawing at the corner of the barn floor, claws scraping against wood. "Come on," Dan muttered, rubbing his temple. "You trying to dig up the whole continent, boy?" His words slurred but carried a crooked humor. Scout paused, tilted his head in that way dogs do when they refuse to acknowledge mockery, then resumed digging with determined force. The barn smelled of rot and mold, hay long gone to dust. Dan stumbled closer, his boots crunching the damp straw. He leaned against a post as Scout clawed with methodical urgency. Then it happened. A board gave a sharp crack, popping upward at the edge. Beneath it was darkness, a cavity where no one expected one. Dan blinked. the fog of liquor burning away in an instant. Inside the hole was a metal container, rusted but solid, the kind of footlocker used by the military decades ago. Its edges were corroded, but the lock remained intact. Dan hauled it out with a grunt, dust and cobwebs spilling around him. Scout stood back, tail wagging once, a silent acknowledgement of duty done. Dan carried the box into the kitchen. With a pry bar, he cracked it open, the hinges shrieking like something protesting being disturbed. Inside lay a thick leather-bound journal, a brass key shaped like a T, and a small metal plate engraved with strange etchings. Dan lifted the plate. It was cold, etched with what looked like frequencies, numbers arranged in careful rows. The journal's pages were filled with his father's handwriting, firm block letters, notes, diagrams. Dan stared at them, but the letters danced in confusion. His father had always been precise, but here there was a coded rhythm, abbreviations and markings Dan did not understand. He thought of June Whitaker, the town librarian. June was 34, slender with a tall frame and auburn hair usually twisted into a bun that fell loose when she worked too long among dusty shelves. Her face was pale, freckled lightly, her eyes the clear green of river water. She had been known as the quiet girl in school, the one who escaped into books while others escaped into rebellion. Years earlier, a car accident had taken her younger brother, and since then she carried a gentleness toward anyone broken, especially those who carried ghosts. Her voice was soft but steady, and her hands moved with care, as though afraid everything might shatter. The next afternoon, Dan brought the journal to the library, Scout pacing at his side. Patrons turned as the big dog padded in, his coat glossy despite his age, his scar and crooked ear marking him as a survivor. June looked up from the counter, blinking behind round spectacles. "Dan Harper," she said, her voice cautious but kind. "And Scout, right? Your father used to bring him here to wait outside." Dan set the journal on the counter. "Can you make sense of this?" His voice carried both irritation and hope. June flipped carefully through the pages, her fingers tracing lines of notes. "These are not random scribbles," she murmured. She pointed to a series of numbers written along the margins. "These are frequency ranges. Your father was recording radio transmissions. See here, HF, UHF, and these coordinates. They're mapped like a grid." Dan leaned closer, the scent of paper and dust filling his nose. He hadn't been this close to someone since leaving the service. Why would he be writing these down? June hesitated, then looked up at him. Whatever it was, he wanted it hidden, and he wanted you to find it. Dan looked down at Scout, who had settled at his boots, eyes sharp, ears flicking toward the window as if always guarding. The dog gave a low whine, pressing his muzzle against Dan's hand. For the first time, Dan felt the weight of the discovery, not just a hidden box, but a message reaching from the grave. That night, back at the farmhouse, Dan placed the journal, the brass tea key, and the etched plate on the kitchen table. Rain tapped against the glass, the wind howled through the broken shutters. He sat long into the night, flipping pages, trying to decode what his father had meant. Scout lay nearby, occasionally lifting his head to bark twice short, once long, whenever he heard the storm rattle the barn door. The floor beneath them creaked as if breathing, the old house groaning against the weight of wind. Dan poured one last drink but didn't touch it. He stared at the journal instead, the lamp casting shadows across the ink. Scout's steady gaze anchored him, reminding him of the father who had named the dog after that first mountain rescue. Loyalty, persistence, survival. For the first time in weeks, Dan felt something other than regret. He felt a beginning. The storm had passed, leaving Willow Creek washed in silver frost and an air that cut like glass. The orchard's bare branches glittered with ice, each twig holding tiny prisms that fractured the weak morning light. Dan Harper stood in the barn, the journal open on the workbench beside a rusted lantern. He had barely slept. The words on those pages had burned into his mind. His father had written with the precision of a man accustomed to secrets, each line a mixture of technical notes and fragments of thought that read like instructions disguised as diary. Dan traced the margin with his thumb. There it was again. Relay node, sentinel spur. The phrase repeated throughout the entries, circled once in red ink. Below, a sketch of the barn's electrical box and a sequence of numbers. Dan glanced at the breaker panel, a corroded sheet of steel at the far wall. Scout sat beside it, tail thumping lightly, as if he too had been studying the sketch all along. The breaker had been dead for years. The orchard had no reason to draw more than a trickle of power. But Dan followed the sequence, flipping switches in the order scrawled by his father's hand. Each click echoed like a shot in the cold barn. For a moment nothing happened, and he almost laughed at himself. Then a low hum spread through the floorboards, subtle at first, then rising like breath beneath the wood. The far wall shuddered, and dust sifted from the rafters. Slowly, impossibly, a section of the wall slid inward, revealing the edge of a door that did not belong to any barn. Dan stared, throat dry. The door was steel, brushed smooth, set into a frame of reinforced concrete. A faint green light pulsed above the handle. Scout barked once, sharp and insistent, then pressed his nose to the seam. Dan lifted the brass T-shaped key from his pocket, the one he had found in the footlocker. The key slid into a recess beside the handle and turned with a mechanical sigh. The door parted with a hiss, and warm, filtered air drifted outward. Inside stretched a corridor lined with brushed metal, the kind of construction Dan had seen only on naval bases. Fluorescent lights flickered on automatically, guiding him downward into a chamber that could not possibly exist beneath his father's failing orchard. He descended the narrow steps with Scout close behind, each footfall echoing in a space too modern, too deliberate to be hidden here. The chamber opened into a large room, rows of steel shelving, sealed crates, stacks of binders marked with coded tags, and along one wall, a bank of computers frozen in standby. Against the opposite wall sat 3 cases, each open to reveal bars of gold stacked neatly, their surfaces gleaming beneath the sterile light. Dan stopped short, his breath shallow. The scale of it was staggering. On the central table lay a small console with an inset screen. As Dan approached, it flickered to life, and his father's voice filled the room, recorded but steady, the same commanding tone that had filled his childhood home. "If you are here, it means you followed the signs," Colonel Harper said. His weathered face appeared on the screen, uniform crisp, eyes sharp even through time. "This is Sentinel Spur, not a treasure, not a prize. A relay node for Project Aurora, a black-budget initiative never meant to see daylight. What you see here represents over $500 million in resources, equipment, gold reserves, operational data. None of it is yours. All of it is a responsibility." Dan gripped the edge of the console, listening. His father continued. "I was custodian, not owner. The orchard was a mask, the orchard keeper a cover. I knew one day I would not return. So I leave it to you, Daniel. Not because you are the strongest, but because you carry silence with you. If you lose your way, trust Scout. He has always known where to lead." The message ended, leaving only the hum of servers and the steady panting of the dog beside him. Dan lowered himself onto a stool, his head in his hands. His father had lived a double life, hiding a world beneath rotting wood and empty fields. All this time, while Dan had thought the old man cared only for rules and order, he had been guarding something far larger than any family could imagine. Scout nudged his knee, tail brushing against the floor. Dan looked up at the rows of gold. The temptation was immediate, raw. $50,000 was a joke compared to this. He could clear the debt, rebuild, start anew. Yet his father's words rang in his ears. Not a treasure. He rose and walked to the stack, staring at the neat lines of wealth. His reflection glimmered on the metal, fractured into pieces. Slowly he closed the lid, turned away, and picked up the thick binder marked Operations Manual. Hours passed as Dan read, Scout lying beside him, occasionally lifting his head at the creaks of the orchard above. The manual detailed relay procedures, communication protocols, contingency measures if the network was compromised. Every page confirmed what his father had said. This was not loot, it was infrastructure, a quiet backbone of intelligence operations that could not be allowed to slip into the wrong hands. At one point, Dan leaned back, rubbing his eyes. Scout yawned, stretched, and walked toward a section of the wall where an emergency socket protruded, painted red. The dog sat, ears forward, staring. Dan followed, reading the small print. Relay node, Sentinel Spur, emergency power. His father had even written in the journal. If Daniel loses his way, watch Scout. He will know. Dan felt a strange laugh rise in his chest. Of course you know, don't you? He muttered. The dog wagged his tail once, solemnly. As dusk settled above ground, Dan climbed back up, leaving the chamber sealed once more. The barn returned to silence, but he carried the weight of what he had seen. He poured himself a glass of whiskey in the kitchen, stared at it, then pushed it aside, untouched. Scout rested at his feet, amber eyes glinting in the lamplight. The orchard still looked broken, the debt still impossible, but beneath it all lay a secret that was now his to guard, not a treasure, a responsibility. The morning after Dan had sealed the barn once more, the orchard looked less like a ruin and more like a waiting stage. A fresh crust of frost clung to the grass, crunching under his boots as he carried an armful of split firewood toward the porch. The air had that dry brightness particular to Wyoming winters, where the sun could blaze across the horizon yet fail to bring any warmth. Scout padded beside him, alert even at rest, his tail swaying like a steady metronome. The dog's amber eyes scanned the tree line every few seconds, as if he expected movement where Dan saw only shadows. The creak of tires on gravel broke the silence. Dan stiffened, dropping the wood into the box by the steps. A dark sedan rolled to a stop by the gate, too new, too polished for a town like Willow Creek. Out stepped a woman who carried authority in the set of her shoulders and the firm click of her boots on frozen dirt. She wore a navy trench coat cut close to her frame, her black gloves tucked neatly into her belt. This was Nora Pike. She was 40, tall, with an athletic build honed by field work, her hair a dark brown streaked with the faintest silver, cut just below the jawline for practicality. Her face was angular but not unfriendly, her hazel eyes steady in a way that suggested she measured everything, landscapes, words, and people with equal precision. Nora had built a reputation in Homeland Security as someone who played by the book but kept her own counsel, shaped partly by a childhood spent moving between military bases with her father, a career officer. She had grown up understanding discipline but craving stability, and that longing had hardened into a calm that others sometimes mistook for coldness. "Mr. Harper?" she called, her voice firm but polite. Dan didn't move at first. He studied her stance, the government plates on the car, the way she kept her left hand free near her coat seam habit of someone used to carrying a sidearm. Scout was already in position, body angled between Dan and the stranger, a silent barricade. The dog's head was lowered, but his ears were pricked, ready to act. "Yes," Dan answered finally, his voice low. Nora climbed the porch steps with unhurried confidence. "I'm Special Agent Nora Pike, Department of Homeland Security. May we talk?" Scout let out a low growl, not hostile but a warning. Nora crouched a little, keeping her movement slow, and extended a hand. "And you must be Scout. I've read about you." She gave a small smile. "Came across the records of your early training. A real heavyweight in his day." She clicked her tongue softly, then glanced at Dan. "Mind if I?" Dan nodded once, reluctantly. Scout sniffed her glove, then relaxed slightly when Nora gently checked his teeth like an old vet would. Still strong. He could work another 5 years if he had to. She scratched under his ear, earning a grunt of approval from the shepherd. Inside the kitchen, Dan kept his posture defensive, shoulders squared as Nora set a slim folder on the table. The room smelled faintly of stale whiskey, though the bottle still stood unopened since the night before. On the wall above the table hung a faded photograph, Colonel Harper, younger, standing with Scout as a puppy at his side, both gazes locked forward, flames from a campfire reflected in the dog's eyes. Nora paused at the sight, then turned back to Dan. "Your father," she began, "was what we called a key custodian. Sentinel Spur wasn't his to own, it was his to guard. He passed that duty on to you, though I'm guessing you discovered that the hard way." Dan folded his arms. "And what exactly are you here for?" Nora's expression tightened, her professional mask sliding into place. "There's a group operating out of Montana and Nevada. They traffic in IED components, detonators, shaped charges, signal jammers, sophisticated equipment. We have reason to believe they've identified your location. They'll come for what's in the relay node." Dan's jaw clenched. "Then why not move it?" "Because it's part of a living network," Nora said. "Shut one node down and the system falters. Besides, pulling everything out would attract attention, and that would undo the decades of cover your father built. We can't risk that. What we can do is ask you to hold the line, with our support." She leaned forward. "In return, we'll petition the county to freeze your outstanding tax bill for 90 days. That gives you breathing room." Dan glanced at the unopened whiskey bottle, then pushed it toward the sink. Without a word, he twisted off the cap and poured the contents down the drain. The smell of alcohol rose sharp and acrid, then was gone. Nora raised a brow but said nothing. Scout settled on the floor between them, his body a line drawn across the room, watching the door as though guarding the conversation itself. A knock interrupted. Dan opened the door to find June Whitaker, cheeks pink from the cold, holding a pie tin wrapped in foil. She wore a wool coat 2 sizes too large, her auburn hair messy from the wind, and carried that earnest nervousness that made her seem both fragile and steady. "Thought you could use something warm," she said, offering the pie. Her eyes flicked to Nora, then to the open folder on the table. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "It's fine," Dan muttered. But June had already heard the word tax slip in earlier. Her brows knit. "If it's about the orchard levy, we could organize a farmer's market. Seasonal crafts, apple cider people in town would come. Might not be 50,000, but it would make a dent." She gave Dan a hopeful look, then excused herself quickly, leaving the pie on the counter. When the door shut again, Nora chuckled softly. "She cares. You should listen." Dan shook his head. "The orchard's dead. No market's going to save it." "Maybe not," Nora said. "But people who care, they can save you in other ways." She stood, collecting her folder. "I'll check in again. In the meantime, keep Scout close. If your father trusted him, so do I. And one more thing, do not underestimate the men who want what's beneath your barn. They won't come politely." When she was gone, Dan leaned against the sink, staring at the empty bottle dripping water into the drain. Scout nudged his hand with his muzzle, amber eyes fixed steady on him. Dan scratched behind his ear, whispering, "Guess it's just us on the line, buddy." The photograph on the wall seemed to watch, his father's stoic gaze lingering as though to remind him. This was not a burden, it was the family duty he could no longer ignore. The wind that night blew hard across Willow Creek, carrying with it the smell of snow from the high ridges. The orchard creaked under the pressure of gusts that rattled every loose board and sent the bare branches knocking against each other like skeletal fingers. Dan had been sitting at the kitchen table, the journal spread open in front of him, when Scout lifted his head from the rug. The German shepherd's ears pricked, body taut, a low rumble starting in his chest. Dan froze. He had learned to read the dog's warnings. This wasn't the restless growl of a distant coyote. Scout was tuned to something closer, heavier. Dan went to the window, peering through a crack in the curtain. On the road below, half hidden by the slope of the hill, a dark truck idled with its lights off. The engine ticked faintly in the cold air. The journal's instructions came back to him in sharp clarity protocols his father had scrawled across the margins. If compromised, cut power, force intruders into the choke points. Dan stood, moving quickly but silent. He yanked the main switch in the fuse box, plunging the house into darkness. Outside, the orchard disappeared into shadow, only the faint glow of the moon marking the skeletal outline of the barn. Scout was already at the door, hackles raised, amber eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Dan reached into the drawer and pulled out the slim silver whistle he had found in the footlocker. It was an ultrasonic training tool, tuned for commands Scout had learned years earlier. He slipped it into his pocket, then grabbed the length of rope from the apple shed, frayed but strong. The first intruder came through the side of the barn, a broad man with a crowbar in one hand and a flashlight in the other. He was dressed in black work clothes, his face obscured by a ski mask. Scout launched from the shadows, his 100-pound frame colliding with the man's chest. The shepherd struck with precision, jaws snapping just above the man's elbow while his body drove into the man's center of mass. The crowbar clattered to the floor as the intruder toppled backward with a grunt, the air knocked from his lungs. Dan followed fast, rope in hand. He hauled the man's wrists together, wrapping the cord tight and finishing with a knot learned long ago from Coast Guard days. The man thrashed once, then stilled under Scout's growl, hot breath in his face. A second figure slipped in through the rear, slimmer, carrying a long knife. Dan blew the ultrasonic whistle once sharp, brief. Scout broke off instantly, retreating to Dan's side, hackles still bristling. The intruder lunged, but Scout was faster. With a snarl, the dog leapt again, hitting the man low at the knees. The blade skittered away across the floor as the figure went down hard. Dan kicked the knife out of reach, then pinned the intruder with his knee, binding his wrists with what remained of the rope. The barn was silent for a moment except for Scout's heavy breathing and the groans of the men on the ground. Then, outside, gravel crunched. Dan turned in time to see a third man standing near the truck, watching. Unlike the others, he didn't rush forward. He lingered, head tilted as if memorizing every detail. When Scout barked, the man sprinted back into the cab and the truck roared to life. Tires spun on the frozen dirt before the vehicle disappeared into the darkness, taillights flaring briefly before vanishing down the highway. Dan bent to check Scout. The dog's right shoulder bore a shallow gash where the second man's knife had grazed him. Blood clung dark against the shepherd's fur. Dan's chest tightened, anger and fear mixing in a way that felt like fire. He tore a strip from an old flannel shirt, pressing it against the wound before wrapping it firm. "You saved me," he whispered, voice cracking. "Thank you, brother." Scout licked his hand once, eyes calm despite the pain. A pair of headlights cut through the night then, approaching fast. Dan's muscles tensed again, but this time the vehicle was familiar, Nora Pike's government sedan. She stepped out, pistol drawn, her breath puffing white in the cold. When she saw the two intruders tied and bleeding in the barn, she lowered the weapon and pulled a small flashlight from her coat. She crouched beside the crowbar, running her gloved fingers across the steel until she found the etched numbers near the handle. "Serial number," she murmured. "Standard issue for a supply lot in Casper. That narrows the trail." She bagged it carefully, her face hard with focus. "These aren't random burglars. They came prepared." Dan leaned against the wall, exhaustion pulling at him. "And they'll be back." "Yes," Nora said bluntly. "But tonight you and Scout held them. That matters." She gave the shepherd a glance, then touched the bandage Dan had wrapped. "He took a hit for you." Dan nodded, running a hand over Scout's head. "He always does." By morning, word had spread quietly through town. June Whitaker arrived with a thermos of coffee and a small folding table. She set up at the gate of the orchard, pouring cups for the federal agents who had come to collect the prisoners. The sight of the town's librarian, auburn hair messy in the wind, serving coffee to stern men in black jackets made even Dan crack a smile. "If you don't keep them warm, they won't do their jobs right," she told him, cheeks flushed, and the agents chuckled despite themselves. The orchard still stood broken. The debt still loomed like a storm cloud. But that morning the Harper place felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. Scout sat on the porch steps, bandage clean, ears perked as he watched everything unfold. His gaze was steady, proud, as if even he understood that the night had proven something vital. This wasn't just Dan's burden anymore. It was theirs, man and dog, side by side. The days after the raid blurred together, though the cold seemed sharper now, cutting deeper with each dawn. Willow Creek lay under a brittle crust of ice, the streets slick and the town moving slower than usual. Dan had been pacing the length of the orchard most mornings, restless, carrying the journal under one arm as if its weight alone could anchor him. Scout healed quickly from his wound, though the bandage remained wrapped around his shoulder. He moved with the stubborn strength of an old soldier who refused to be slowed. Nora Pike had stayed in town longer than expected, working quietly from her sedan parked outside the courthouse or making phone calls from the porch of the orchard house. She rarely raised her voice, but there was an intensity about her eyes always narrowed as though calculating the next move. One afternoon, she spread a set of photographs across Dan's kitchen table. They showed the serial number from the crowbar matched to a supply yard in Casper, along with grainy images of men loading trucks at night. "This isn't freelance," she said, her voice clipped. "It's organized, and it's local enough to have roots here." Dan's jaw tightened. "You're saying someone I know?" "I'm saying someone close enough to use a warehouse near Casper," Nora replied. She tapped one photo where a figure's profile caught the edge of a camera frame. "This one's been seen at the bus depot storage bays on the east side of town." Dan leaned in, eyes narrowing, his stomach twisted. The man in the blurred photo had the broad shoulders and restless posture he knew too well. His brother, Kyle Harper. The next evening, Dan drove into town, Scout in the passenger seat, pressing his nose against the cold window. The bus depot loomed like a skeleton of steel and concrete, its parking lot cracked and rimed with frost. Rows of storage bays lined one side, the roll-up doors streaked with rust. Dan killed the engine, sat for a moment, then stepped out. Scout followed, ears pricked, tail stiff with tension. Inside one of the dimly lit bays, he found Kyle hunched over a crate, his sandy hair disheveled, his coat thin against the cold. Kyle's face looked older, worn, though only 39. His eyes darted up when he saw Dan, fear flashing across them before settling into forced bravado. "Dan," Kyle said with a shaky grin. "Didn't expect you." Dan's voice was flat. "Cut the act. You've been dealing with them." Kyle's jaw tightened. "I didn't have a choice." He shoved his hands into his pockets, shifting on his feet. You don't know what it's like, owing the kind of people I owe. They don't give options. You led them to us, Dan snapped. Scout stepped forward, growling low, the sound reverberating in the empty bay. Kyle flinched, eyes darting to the dog. I never wanted it to go that far. They made me keep tabs, that's all, I swear. Dan wanted to hit him, to shake him until the truth spilled out, but Scout pressed against his leg, anchoring him. His father's words echoed in his memory. Mission first, revenge later. He took a slow breath. This ends now. Whatever debt you owe, it doesn't buy my dog or what's under that barn. Kyle looked away, shame darkening his face. I'll try, Dan. I will. But they won't let go. Dan left him there, fury simmering but restrained. He drove back in silence, Scout leaning against him, the steady heartbeat of the dog keeping him from unraveling. That night, the storm broke. When Dan awoke near midnight, the house was too quiet. He called Scout's name, but the only answer was the whistling of the wind through the orchard. Panic surged. He found the back door open, the frame splintered. Scout was gone. Minutes later, his phone buzzed, the screen lighting with a message. The shepherd for the key. Tomorrow. Midnight. Bring the data, or you'll never see him again. Dan's hand trembled as he read. Rage flooded his chest, but then he remembered his father's voice from the recording. Not treasure, responsibility. He set the phone down, gripping the counter until his knuckles whitened. By dawn, Nora was back at the orchard. She found Dan already awake, eyes red, the whistle clutched in his hand like a prayer. They have Scout, he said simply. Nora's expression hardened, though her voice was steady. Then we don't give them what they want. We bait them. They spent the day preparing. Dan retrieved an empty hard case, identical to the one holding his father's true data. Nora filled it with decoy files and transmitters, designed to ping once opened. They'll think they've won, she explained, until it's too late. Meanwhile, June appeared quietly at the porch, clutching a receipt from the farm supply store. She had been tidying the library when she noticed a curious purchase logged under Mary Beth's name, heavy-duty chain, and a dog collar. Her face was pale when she handed it to Dan. Your sister bought these 2 days ago. I thought you should know. Dan stared at the slip, his jaw tightening. So she's in it too. Maybe not leading, June said softly, but complicit. Dan folded the paper, pocketing it. Betrayal cut deep, but he had no time for grief. He walked to the barn, leaving one of his handkerchiefs, sweat-soaked and worn, inside the cab of the truck he knew the enemy used. He pressed it beneath the seat cushion where only a dog's nose could find it. If Scout had the chance, he would follow that scent home. As night fell again, Dan sat at the kitchen table, the decoy case gleaming under the lamplight. Nora checked her sidearm, calm and deliberate. We do this by the book. Mission first, she reminded him. Dan nodded, though his eyes burned. And Scout second, always Scout. The old rail yard stretched like a skeleton of steel and rot against the Wyoming night. The air was raw with the sting of rust and coal dust, carrying the faint whistle of wind through hollow freight cars that hadn't moved in decades. Floodlights cast uneven shadows across the cracked asphalt, where weeds had pushed through like stubborn ghosts. Dan eased out of his truck at the far edge, his breath steaming in the cold. He wore no weapon, no pack, just the same battered coat his father used to wear. His hands were already raised in plain sight as he walked toward the cavernous freight shed at the center of the yard. Inside, Scout's barking cracked through the silence like gunfire. The sound was hoarse but fierce, each snap of teeth echoing with desperation. Chains rattled heavy ones, bolted to an old track anchor. Dan's heart tightened. The bastards had chained his brother in arms like an animal. Pike's team had already fanned out in the dark beyond the shed. They were shadows blending with shadows, crouched among the rusting cars and broken pallets. Dan knew they were there only because he had walked the ground with them 2 hours earlier, mapping every step. Pike herself was crouched in the skeleton of a coal hopper 30 yards to the east. The agent's steady breathing, even from a distance, was like an anchor holding the storm inside Dan's chest. At the door of the shed, a figure stepped forward, the leader. He was taller than Dan remembered from the grainy surveillance stills, with the build of a man who had once been strong but was now rotted by indulgent shoulders sloping, guts soft under a tactical vest. His face was partially obscured by a cheap ski mask, but his eyes were sharp, restless, darting with the nerves of a gambler who knew the house was closing in. He kept the pistol leveled square at Dan's chest. "Where's the drive?" His voice was low and bitter, not a shout, just the controlled menace of a man who thought fear could serve him better than bullets. Dan lifted both hands higher, palms open. "I came alone, just like you said." He angled his body slightly, stepping into the floodlight so the shadow behind him would stretch long and broad across the cracked floor. It was theater, and he knew Scout would understand the cue. His father had drilled hand signs into both of them like gospel. 2 fingers meant wait. A fist meant strike. Tonight, those old lessons were going to save them. Kyle emerged from the gloom, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast. His clothes were wrinkled and dirty, his hair greasy under the brim of a faded ball cap. He looked like a man hollowed out by too many debts and too many nights without sleep. His hands trembled as he carried a duffel bag, empty by the sag of its seams. "Dan," he muttered, his voice breaking like old wood, "I didn't want this." Dan caught his brother's eyes and saw the wreckage there, shame, fear, and the faintest glimmer of hope. The leader shoved Kyle forward. "Put it down." His pistol never wavered. Kyle dropped the bag at Dan's feet and stepped back. Dan bent slowly, keeping his movements exaggerated, deliberate. His right hand brushed the floor near his boot and clenched into a fist for just half a second, enough for the chain-rattling dog across the room to catch. Scout lunged, the chain snapping taut. Then, with a violent twist, the clasp that Dan had loosened earlier gave way. The German Shepherd, grizzled and scarred but still a war machine in muscle and will, exploded forward. He launched low, slamming into the gut of the masked leader with a force that cracked the man against the side of a steel rack. The gun went off once, the muzzle flash lighting the rafters, but the shot went wild. Scout's weight sent the pistol skittering across the floor. Chaos erupted. Pike's team surged from the shadows, their boots pounding like a second heartbeat. Flashlights cut through the gloom as commands snapped. "Federal agents, hands where I can see them." The 2 other thugs in the room, startled and sloppy, tried to run for the far exit, but were tackled before they'd made 10 yards. Kyle stood frozen, his chest heaving, eyes wide like a deer trapped in headlights. Dan crossed the distance in 3 strides, gripping his brother's arm hard enough to hurt. Kyle flinched, then sagged to his knees, muttering, I'm sorry," over and over. Dan stared down at him, fists trembling, rage pressing at his ribs like a hot iron. But Scout's bark pulled him back sharp, protective, alive. Dan knelt and pressed his forehead against the shepherd's scarred head, whispering, "You did it, old man. You brought us home." Pike strode in, her black coat flaring behind her. She moved with the precise grace of someone who had lived in dangerous rooms her entire life. Her gray eyes flicked from the cuffed men to Kyle to Dan, assessing, tallying, already shaping the report that would go back to Washington. She didn't smile, but she gave a small nod to Dan. "Good work." June burst in moments later, hauling a canvas veterinary kit nearly as big as she was. She had insisted on being nearby just in case, despite Pike's protests. Her apron still smelled of flour and cinnamon, the faint trace of her cafe clinging even in the oil-slick stink of the shed. She dropped to her knees beside Scout, running gentle hands over his fur until she found the shallow slice along his shoulder. "Nothing a few stitches won't fix," she said, her voice half relief, half irritation. "You big lug scaring us like that." Scout leaned into her touch, tail thumping once against the floor before his amber eyes drifted back to Dan. In the corner, Kyle raised his head, tears streaking down his unshaven cheeks. "I didn't want to betray you," he said hoarsely. "They had me by the throat. Debt collectors, threats. I thought I could stall them. I thought—" His voice collapsed under the weight of its own excuses. Dan closed his eyes, hearing his father's words echo again. Mission first, vengeance later. He forced his fists to unclench. "We'll deal with it," he said, voice flat. "But tonight, it's over." The leader groaned under the weight of Pike's agents pinning him. His mask had been torn away, revealing a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and a tattoo curling up his neck. His eyes burned with a hatred that promised this was not the end. Pike crouched, whispering something cold into his ear before signaling her men to haul him out. For a long moment, the shed was quiet, but for the steady pant of Scout and the distant hum of the Wyoming night. Dan sat on the cracked floor, his arm draped over the shepherd's broad shoulders. He felt the tremor of exhaustion in the dog's body, but also the stubborn strength that had carried them through every fight. June's hands moved quick and sure with the bandages, muttering under her breath about stubborn men and their even more stubborn dogs. Kyle's sobs quieted into silence. He sat slumped against a crate, broken but alive, and for now, that was enough. Dan exhaled slowly, the weight of revenge slipping off him like old armor. He had chosen differently. He had chosen family, duty, and the bond of a scarred old dog who had never once left his side. The trial of months, the storms, betrayals, night raids, and the shiver of steel in abandoned depots had finally subsided into something resembling calm. The smuggler's ring that had haunted the ridges of Wyoming was dismantled. From the freight yard in Casper to the hidden caches along the Platte, the network had unraveled beneath Pike's precision and Dan's unrelenting endurance. Federal marshals confirmed it in the crisp language of reports. The data vaults and the bars of gold had been secured as state evidence. In turn, Washington had sent word that Harper Orchard would be shielded under a package of deferred taxes and relief incentives. Strange how letters from the Capitol could feel like sunlight through gray clouds. Dan stood on the porch the morning the confirmation arrived, the paper in his calloused hand. He was a broad-shouldered man, now leaner from months of strain, the lines on his brow softened by something close to peace. He read it twice, then let the corner of his mouth lift in a smile, small, tired, but true. Scout padded up beside him, the great German shepherd's amber eyes alert even in stillness. His left ear, always flopped just slightly, twitched at the rustling of paper. At 10 years old, with black and tan fur grizzled faintly with gray and a faint scar along his rib, Scout no longer needed to prove anything. He simply was, loyal, steadfast, the guardian whose presence made walls stronger than stone. By noon, the orchard had found its pulse again. Workers from the county, men and women with weather-worn skin and steady hands, brought ladders, hammers, and timber to mend fences and reinforce the old apple sheds. At their head was Earl Jennings, a stout farmer with a beard white as frost, who had once taught Dan how to set irrigation lines. Earl's voice boomed like a church bell, barking orders, laughing at mistakes, and cursing at bent nails in the same breath. "If Uncle Sam's finally giving you a break, Harper, don't waste it. Let's get these trees breathing again." His broad palms clapped Dan on the shoulder with affection heavy as stone. Meanwhile, June had transformed a corner of the farmyard into something out of a postcard. She had always been a woman who found light in fractures, tall, willow-thin, with auburn hair forever caught by the wind. She carried a scar on her left forearm from an accident years ago when a lantern fell in her family's barn. It had left her wary of flame but never dimmed her courage. That day she set up a small wooden counter near the orchard gate, stringing bunting across its beams, and brewed hot apple cider that steamed in tin pitchers. "For the workers," she said, handing mugs with a smile so natural it warmed the air around her. Her laughter rose above the hammering and sawdust, a reminder that life could be kind, even after it had been cruel. The wooden sign was raised next, a broad plank freshly painted, the letters carved deep and sure, Harper Orchard and K9 Rescue. Dan had spent nights sketching it, tracing the loops and lines until they felt right. Beneath the name was etched the silhouette of a German shepherd, poised in mid-step, tail proud. Villagers gathered to watch as Earl and two younger farmhands hoisted it upright and bolted it to the arch of the main gate. The crowd applauded, and someone whistled. The orchard was no longer just a business, it was a promise stitched back together with faith and grit. That afternoon, federal representatives arrived for a brief inspection, their black SUVs stirring dust on the road. Among them was Vanessa Green, a federal tax officer with a measured gait and sharp dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She was not unkind, but years in bureaucracy had carved her into precision itself, no smile wasted, no word without weight. She shook Dan's hand firmly, her grip dry and quick. "Mr. Harper, the evidence is now secured. Your compliance has been exemplary. Consider this orchard under protection." There was no poetry in her tone, but Dan knew it was the kind of blessing only Washington could give. When she left, June quipped, "She smiles less than a cat in a rainstorm," and the orchard crew erupted in laughter. Toward evening, Pike's letter arrived, a plain postcard bearing the picture of a windmill against the plains. His handwriting was slanted but strong. "Mission complete. Keep the wind on those hills, Harper." Dan read it aloud to June by lamplight. She smiled softly and said, He's a soldier even in ink. Dan tucked the card into the frame of an old photograph of his father, letting the words rest where they belonged. The festival came days later. Willow Creek had waited too long to see the orchard alive. Families poured through the gates, children running between rows of trees where lanterns hung like low stars. A fiddler played near the barn, while tables of pies, roasted corn, and cinnamon rolls lined the hay bales. Dan wore his flannel shirt and worked the cider barrels, pouring mugs with a grin that came easier than it had in years. June moved among the crowd, her laughter trailing behind her like a ribbon. And Scout lay by the porch steps, one paw crossed over the other, the afternoon sun slanting across his fur. Children dared to reach out to him, and he accepted their hands with the solemn dignity of an elder statesman. His left ear flicked in rhythm with the wind chimes that now hung above, the same chimes that had once belonged to Dan's mother, rescued from a dusty attic and rehung by the neighbors. Their soft music mingled with the fiddler's tune, weaving a melody both fragile and enduring. Dan stepped onto the porch, cider mug in hand, and looked out across the orchard. The hills rolled gentle into twilight, lanterns swinging, laughter rising, and Scout's steady breathing anchoring it all. He had chosen forgiveness over vengeance, family over fracture, duty over bitterness. And here it was, the reward. Not wealth, not fame, but the orchard open again, alive in the company of neighbors, friends, and the faithful dog whose loyalty had stitched the broken seams of a man's life. He whispered into the night air, the words meant for no one and everyone. We're home. In the end, this was never just about a farm, or even a soldier and his loyal dog. It was about faith, that even when betrayal cuts deep and the cold winds of life seem endless, God can turn brokenness into blessing. The orchard bloomed again, not by chance, but by grace. Scout, once nearly lost, became a symbol of new beginnings, proof that loyalty and love are the truest miracles we can carry. And maybe that's the lesson for us all. No matter how abandoned, tired, or hopeless you feel, the Lord can bring light back into your winter. Just as He opened the doors of that orchard, He can open doors in your life too. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that hope is never gone. Leave a comment below, subscribe for more stories of faith and second chances, and join us in prayer. Type Amen in the comments if you believe God still works miracles today. May He bless you and your family, and may your orchard, whatever it may be, bloom again.